I'm Fran Moreland Johns, and I was born June the 8th, 1933, in Porto Alegre, Brazil. My parents were Methodist educational missionaries, and they went, my mother from Virginia and my father from Texas, separately, and they met and married in Porto Alegre and had 4 daughters. I'm the last. Both of my grandparents, my maternal and paternal grandfathers, were both Methodist circuit rider preachers. And so when my parents went to Brazil, they took the pledge. It was a long time ago. It was a century ago, but they were absolutely committed to their faith. So I grew up in the Methodist church. Interestingly, my sisters and I all wound up in different, one sister became a dedicated agnostic, but the others, we were in different Protestant denominations. But anyway, so then we came back to the States in the mid-1930s. I was just tiny. I was not quite 3, but it was clear that bad stuff was going to be coming, and they figured they needed to get back. So I grew up, we were a couple of years in Nashville, but then I grew up in Virginia. We moved to Ashland, Virginia in 1939. I was 6, and my dad took over as president of Randolph-Macon College, which is still going strong in beautiful downtown Ashland, Virginia. It was not going strong at the time. It was a men's college. It was the end of the Depression. The buildings were falling apart. The faculty was old, but still great. And then the war hit, and there were no students. So I didn't see a lot of my father in those years. He was on the road trying to raise money to keep the college afloat, which he did with the help of some Army units and Navy units that would need to do training. And for a kid, it was a really good time to grow up. I mean, we had a little gang with a red wagon known as the Junior Helpers. We pulled our little red wagon around town and collected cigarette papers and scraps for the war effort. Living through World War II as a child in that town, in small town, peaceful Virginia, I hate to say it was a good experience, but it certainly was not the terrible experience that the rest of the world had with World War II. So then I went off to Randolph-Macon Women's College, which has since self-destructed. Well, they wouldn't say that, but they went co-ed and changed the name to Randolph College. When I finished Randolph-Macon Women's College in 1953, I had a degree in art. I had 0 talent, and I knew I couldn't do anything with my art, but I had edited the college paper my senior year. I just always loved to write. I can't remember when I didn't love to write. So I went straight into newspaper work. I actually had a brief foray into public relations. My first job was with a PR firm. And there's one wonderful story that is worth telling, because my dad was president of the Virginia United Nations Association in 1953. And they invited Eleanor Roosevelt to come speak. And she said fine, she would come, but she would not speak to a segregated audience, which was one of the things my father was trying to do, was to work against segregation. But anyway, so they had Mrs. Roosevelt speak in the mosque. It was a big auditorium. I think it's still there in downtown Richmond. And because I was with a small public relations firm, I had an in with the association. We got to do the PR for Mrs. Roosevelt and handle that. So to look back on the differences in a century, of almost a century, I went out in an old beat-up Chevrolet to pick up Mrs. Roosevelt at the airport, which is a couple of Quonset huts in the middle of nowhere. And there were maybe a half a dozen of us, and I introduced everybody to Miss Roosevelt, and I think she had one person with her. And from then on, every time she spoke to anybody, she called us by name. And so the editor of the Richmond News Leader, which was the afternoon paper, was an arch conservative, whose name I'm now blanking on. He went on to be a right-wing columnist. But he published an editorial that lambasted everything but motherhood and apple pie that Mrs. Roosevelt stood for. And the paper came out while she was en route in the airplane from New York to Richmond. So we took a copy of the paper, and so she could read it on the way in. And she changed her clothes, came downstairs in the hotel to a press conference that I had amazingly, luckily been able to organize. It was wonderful fun. And every hand went up saying, Ms. Rowe, what about the, what's his name's editorial? And she took a deep breath and looked around the room and smiled and said, I understand your new editor is very bright, very well educated, and very young. And over the years, I have learned to have great patience with youth. And then she took the next question. I have never forgotten it. I just thought it was so wonderful. Soon I moved to Atlanta, just because it was the up-and-coming city of the South at that time. I knew one person there, and she was an old friend, and she said she had room for a roommate, so I took the train to Atlanta. And I spent 5 wonderful years in Atlanta, mostly freelance writing. I did have briefly a 9-to-5-ish job working for the oil industry before the oil industry was a dirty word. And it was a very wonderful time. So in 1958, I married a good man who is still around. We get along really well because we're on separate coasts, but we were together for 22 years and had my 3 extraordinary children. And then that was in Decatur, Georgia, which was part of metropolitan Atlanta. And while I was raising the kids, I was freelancing and doing a lot of work for the city of Decatur and the county that we were in. I covered county commission and city commissions and things like that, and loved all of that. My kids' image of me is a person sitting at my little royal pink typewriter, typing away, and while they are saying, "What shelf is the cereal on?" And it was by and large a wonderful time. And I raised my kids in Decatur Presbyterian Church. Decatur Pres was really lucky because Columbia Seminary is in the city of Decatur. It was and still is a really wonderful church. And I remember we had a long-time pastor at Decatur Pres who had been there for maybe 20-some years. And he finally left and became president of Columbia Seminary. But he had done everything. He had turned out the lights on Wednesday night suppers. And when he left, the place fell apart. I mean, there was nobody to do anything, and in a way, it prepared me for being in San Francisco when Laird Stewart left, and I was on session at that time. But when I was in Decatur and we were struggling so with trying to get the church back on track, I remember calling my dad and saying, because we used to kid him about how all of his daughters went astray, fell from grace from the Methodist church. And I remember calling him and saying, Daddy, I take it all back. All I want is some bishop somewhere to say, here's your new preacher. But for me, my faith has always been central to how I see myself and how I see the world, because I see the world as what Jesus would like us to be like. And I see myself as, if there's anything I can do to head for my tiny piece of that, to make the world a kinder, gentler place, and to hope people love each other a little better. That's how I see myself. That's the purpose I see. Institutionally, when I came here, I married. I have an erratic marital history. I'm not proud of it. But I finally got it right. I had dated Bud Johns when I was in college, and he was in the Marines. And we went our separate ways for 37 years and had no contact, no nothing. But we ran into each other in Boston in 1991. He was widowed. I was inconveniently married at the time, but I was headed for a divorce. And we married in September of 92. So Bud's late wife, Judith Clancy, an artist who lived with us, me and Bud and the ghost of Judith Clancy, for a very long time. Judith was Jewish, and Bud's father was a Methodist preacher, but he was kind of a classic case of particularly the intelligentsia of the 60s who decided that the church was irrelevant, and the church unfortunately did a lot to confirm that. So Bud was, we called the unchurched, but Laird Stewart used to call him the most loyal non-member that Calvary had, so I was proud of that. But when I came, I knew one person in the state of California, and that was Bud. So it was a jolt, throwing it all up in the air and having it land in California. But he and Judith had always been to Christmas Eve services at Calvary, mainly for the music. I mean, we were so lucky now to have Michael, and for all those years to have had Alden Gilchrist. So when I came, I said to Bud, there are two things I need. One, I don't drink. I swore off the sauce about 40 years ago. So I said to Bud, who loved his martini and he loved good wine, and I said, okay, I need you never to say, won't you try this? And so he was wonderful. We would go to parties. He would take my non-alcoholic wine and stick it in the back of the table. And the second thing I said I needed was to have a church home and to know that he was supportive of it. So one thing that he said was, there's this church at Jackson and Fillmore you might like. Judith and I went there on Christmas Eve. So I went to a few Methodist churches. I church hopped, as a lot of people do. But I walked into Calvary one day and went to coffee hour. And for anybody who remembers those old days, there was this guy with a wonderful, lush handlebar mustache, and his name was Alfonso Sloop. And he greeted me as if we were old friends, and I looked at his name and I said, Sloop, that's an interesting name. Did you have any relatives in Decatur, Georgia? And of course, his cousin had been at Decatur Presbyterian. And Laird Stewart that day, or a day soon when I visited, immediately soon thereafter, Laird preached his sermon for the call. And at the end of that service, I said, "Where's your new member class?" And so I joined, I was in the same new member class with Jenny Stewart. But Alfonso was part of the reason I also was asked to be the liaison with the HIV support group. And that was one of the most meaningful things that I have ever done, was being with that wonderful, wonderful group during a time that was just incredibly awful. And Bud had retired. He still ran a small publishing company, but he spent hours and hours and hours hauling me around to visit with people or picking up meds or taking people to the hospital. It was a crazy time. And we met more often than not at our house, and I would do dinner. That was how I got to know Jim Dees, who was like a brother to me. I still miss Jim. And I first met Gib Sims. Gib was not a part of the HIV group, but he knew a lot of those folks, and he came to Calvary, I think, about the end of that time. The other Calvary connections, when Laird left, Jim Kitchens was our interim. So Jim called me and said, "We need co-chairs for the mission study." No, what was the name of the group? You had to do a self-study. We're going to have to ask Alexa. But he needed a co-chair, and he said, "So I need an older person," and Alexa Frankenberg is going to do it. Then he called Alexa and said to Alexa, "We need a co-chair." And Fran Johns had said, well, Alexa and I both agreed, even if we were tricked into being co-chairs by Jim Kitchens. That was a fascinating time. It was a long couple of years, self-study. That's what it was. You had to do a congregational self-study and everything else. And it would never have worked without Alexa. She knew what she was doing. She ran the meetings, and I just kind of sat there. By the time it was over, Alexa and I had totally bonded. And she is known as my West Coast daughter. She's my first contact if something happens to me, which has happened before. And Alexa will contact my kids. The other part of my West Coast family began when I was doing some kind of an event in Calvin Hall with Elizabeth Cravacci. So Elizabeth and I were working in the kitchen at this, whatever the event was, and we couldn't make the refrigerator door shut, those giant refrigerators. And I said, well, I know that guy who is helping us, and I think his name is Georg. So I went and got him, and Georg came, and he said, "Elizabeth, you must," and this, and the door shut. And I said, "Georg, are you an engineer?" And he said, "No, I'm German." So I have loved Georg from that moment. And he and Bud became very, very close. They were both art addicts and good wine addicts, and Georg became Bud's trustee. And then when he finally found Shante, who is like mine, and very wisely talked Shante into marrying him, they became the other part of my West Coast family, which of course now has grandson Sebastian. So we have had incredibly memorable times, my West Coast family and I. Calvary has been a home to me, and because my beliefs have always been in sync with Calvary. It's been a way of strengthening my faith. Plus, we tend to get great leaders. I remember being at Calvary when 9/11 happened, and nobody knew what to do other than to go to church. And so everybody gathered here. Bud and I had had a call from Miles, my son-in-law, who was then CNN's morning anchor. And I knew the phone rang, woke me up, and Bud took the phone in the other room and came back, and I said, is there anything important? He said, no, go back to sleep. And so later when we got up and realized, I said, why didn't you tell me? And he said, because I knew we weren't going to get any sleep for a very long time and there wasn't anything you could do. But it was Calvary that got us, not just me, but this community, through that experience. And I still love walking the mission. I walk all over this place, usually 2 or 3 or 4 miles a day. And Alexa used to live near 24th and Valencia, and so I would walk, or I'd get a lift or a ride to her house and walk home. I loved walking Valencia. But the gentrification that has happened has pushed out so many good people, and I miss them. I lived in a house on it was the last block of Sacramento Street, in a wonderful old house that Bud had bought in 1977, when you could, or 73 maybe, yeah, when you could buy a house in San Francisco without robbing a bank. And when I left, I told my neighbors, I loved the block. We used to have block parties anytime anybody, new person moved in, we'd throw a party, my neighbor across the street and I. But we'd have it in my house because I had more space. And when I left in 2013 to move here, I told my neighbors I was leaving because people I liked couldn't afford to live there anymore. But you didn't see me turning down the money. I mean, people were just throwing money at us. And that enabled me to move. I moved because we knew the wheelchair was coming for Bud. And I could not have looked after him. He didn't need a lot of looking after, but he was wheelchair bound, or we knew he would be soon. And so we moved to the Carlisle in 2013. And I was able to, I kept him for 6 years and was able to help him have the death he wanted, which was, it took a couple of days, and it was here in his own bed. And that's a good segue to talk about the 2 causes that I have invested my life in, mostly since coming to San Francisco and marrying Bud, who is known as the great encourager. He encouraged everything. He had said one day, you always said you wanted to go to grad school. Go to grad school. I'll do everything. So I went to USF and got my MFA in short fiction. And he did everything. He cleaned the house and kept everything going and took other women to events. When I finally got my MFA and started showing up at gallery openings and everything, I think people were a little bewildered that they thought, oh, she's back. Anyway, he also encouraged me at one point when I was talking about the HIV group and some things that had happened, and I had worked as a hospice volunteer briefly when I was in Florida. I had an interim period in Florida. And so I had told a lot of my hospice stories, and then Bud saw so many of the HIV stories, and he kept saying, that's the book. You should do that book. Well, anyway, so I did. And that was the first book I ever produced that was really from my heart. It's called Dying Unafraid, and it's about people who did just that, managed to die without fear. It was a wonderful book to write, and I think it's still worth having. It's out of print, but I think I'm still proud of it. I had written some bad books because I needed money, so I would write, I wrote a corporate president biography or something, fluff stuff that people wanted to pay me a lot to write. But Dying Unafraid was the first book I wrote that I was really proud of. I also, I did, when I was at USF, I did short fiction, and I did collect those stories just a few years ago into a book, which is fun to have. It's not great literature, but they're good stories. But in the interim, I also, in the late 90s, I was among the 1 in 3 women my age who had had an abortion before Roe. And we never spoke of it, never. I was a victim of workplace rape, which had not been invented, that term, in the 1950s. And rape was almost as shocking and shameful as abortion was. But only to the woman, like almost every other woman, had never mentioned it. At the time, I was living with my sister, Mimi. And Mimi and I were like joined at the hip. We shared everything. And she died without ever knowing that story. I didn't even tell her. So in the late 90s, women who had had pre-Roe abortions began talking about it because we started realizing if we didn't tell those stories, nobody would believe how bad it was. And I wound up collecting those stories and then researching other, so it wouldn't just be personal stories. I did a lot of research. And I pitched my agent to do a book on abortion stories. And this was in 2012. And my agent famously said, nobody's interested in that anymore. That's a settled issue. We thought it was all taken care of. And she said she would not take the proposal to a major publisher because she said nobody's interested. I did fortunately wind up publishing that book. It's called Perilous Times, an inside look at abortion before and after Roe v. Wade. And I wound up publishing with a print-on-demand publisher, which turns out to be great because now, until a few years ago, people were paying attention. And so the book, it won't go out of print because it's only in print if somebody wants it. But that has also just been a critical cause to me because I lived it when you didn't have any choice. I lived it when women were dying. I am lucky to be alive. I made it to my physician's office before I bled to death, or I would have bled out. So I've watched this country go from having no options to thinking we settled it, even though Ruth Bader Ginsburg was right. She said we should not have reproductive justice hinge on Roe because, we've seen it didn't work. So now I've watched us go all the way back almost to the Dark Ages. And unfortunately, there are very few of us who lived through the Dark Ages, lived through pre-Roe abortions. There are very few of us still left. And there's no way to fight right now. I mean, we're fighting to hopefully save democracy, but that doesn't leave a lot of space and energy to fight for reproductive justice. And I'm afraid I won't see it return in my lifetime, but I don't know. Donald Trump has done one really good thing for me, which is to have me commit to live to be 96 so I can see somebody else. So for a while I was just in despair, but then I thought, no, I'm going to stick around and do what I can and live to be 96. But it's hard not to worry about this country. I don't know, San Francisco, I think, will survive and prosper again. In other ways, in the ways that are exemplified by Calvary, I think San Francisco has changed for the better, because Calvary and a lot of people in San Francisco and causes rooted in San Francisco are for justice and equality. And that, I think, has always been a part of San Francisco and happily still is. So change happens. And ultimately, hopefully, change in San Francisco and the rest of the world will be for the good. In a lot of ways, I'm just glad to have lived when I did, because I think I lived, even though there were a lot of wars and a lot of assassinations and a lot of bad stuff, I have lived for working towards a century of really good times. So I'm grateful to have lived when I did, and I'm optimistic about the future. So here we are.